Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up. Lazy, sneaky or both. A former Liberal minister criticises the PM over proposed anti-terror laws. Human Rights Commission President Gillian Triggs once again under pressure from the government to step down. And a new global drug survey shows more Australians are seeking out cheaper highs online. And joining me on the panel, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Reporter with RN Background Briefing, Sarah Dingle, and former New South Wales Premier Nathan Rees. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, former Howard Government Minister Amanda Vanstone has savaged Prime Minister Tony Abbott over his backing of a proposal to give the Immigration Minister the power to strip citizenship off accused terrorists. In a column in the Age newspaper, the former Liberal Senator criticised both the policy and the process, accusing Mr Abbott of abandoning proper cabinet protocols. Ms Vanstone said she was for individual freedom and it was profoundly disappointing to see fellow Liberals thinking it's okay for a minister alone to take away a citizen's rights. She was also concerned that rushing the plan through cabinet was lazy, sneaky or both. Now, Nick, they're pretty strong comments from a former cabinet minister of the Howard era. Does Amanda Vanstone have a point?
I was rather taken aback, actually, to be honest, Steve. I mean, it's nothing new. I mean, the minister has had these powers under similar powers under Section 21 of the Citizenship Act since 1948. Indeed, you know, Amanda Vanstone had the power to strip people of their citizenship and did. I mean, she took Christopher Scase's citizenship away from him as a ministerial decision, because that's the power that the minister has. So I don't know what's new in the current laws, in the current proposed laws, except that we're extending this from people who fight for an enemy nation to an enemy force, to a non-state actor like ISIS.
And this proposal seemed to be about potential dual citizens, not people who are actually dual citizens, so I guess that's a bit different.
Well, we haven't actually got there yet. I mean, that's part of the discussion I think they're going to have. I mean, dual citizens I see is completely uncontroversial. I'm surprised that Amanda Vanstone would object to that, particularly, as I say, she used that very power herself as immigration minister. Now, when you get to potential dual citizens or people that are citizens of one country, then it becomes much more difficult. You've got the problem of making somebody stateless, which is problematic for a number of reasons. So that's a discussion which we're going to move on to have. But, you know, where the government is now, I can't see that, you know, it's gone terribly much further than the powers that Minister Vanstone had when she was in government.
Nathan, what did you make of Amanda Vanstone's comments today?
Look, I don't want anyone who goes over to fight for ISIL or on behalf of ISIL to return to Australia, frankly. I'm sympathetic to the rationale behind this, but I do have a concern around process. I don't think it's analogous to the Christopher Scase issue. I don't want a situation in which a minister of the day just needs a Sunday story for a newspaper and all of a sudden pings someone's citizenship. There needs to be some process here. I think there is significant and reasonable public concern around these characters that are engaging in this sort of activity offshore, and a lot of people don't want them back. How you do that in a transparent fashion that is justiciable, that can be appealed and so on, is another discussion to be had. But, you know, whilst ever we're talking about this sort of thing, I reckon Tony Abbott's pretty happy.
Sarah, obviously from Amanda Vanstone's column, you get the sense there was a real sense of despair from her about the process, particularly in relation to how it went to Cabinet and how it was debated there.
Yeah, it's very strong language, and basically what her case, as she outlines it, is that the system with Cabinet papers is designed to extract the best from the minds in the public service and from the ministers and so on to really, you know, make a policy the best it can be. And one of her great concerns is that by just slipping it in, you miss out on that collective brains trust. And the other thing I would say about Christopher Scase is he was a one-off. So what we're talking about here is we know there's a group of more than 100 Australians who are currently overseas, and it would mean affecting a bigger group than just one man who are...
And a good thing too, I mean, I'm with Nathan on this. I mean, I think that the 110, I think half of them we think are possibly dual citizens. I mean, I don't want to see any of them come back in the country. I think they're enormously more dangerous than Christopher Skase. I mean, there's 40 Australians that have died in Iraq and Syria fighting, 3 suicide bombers. That's not really the kind of people I'd like to see back in this country.
But I do think you have to think about why they would come back and the circumstances under which they would come back. And some of them might be, as we've seen, young, pretty impressionable. They go over there and it's horrible. And they want to come back. They can't because we won't let them. So basically we're trapping them in a situation where they have to keep fighting and potentially killing.
But we have a
situation
situation where ACOs are currently watching more than 400 people. Everyone that comes back, harmless as you might think they might be, is going to need watching. And I just think that the burden on ACO, as much as anything, is too much to bear, let alone the fact that one of them might slip through the net and commit some horrible crime.
I certainly don't think they're harmless, but I do think they are a resource to be used. They have knowledge of these groups, which we don't have, to be frank, because they've been with them. If they come back of their own volition, we should know what they know.
Nathan, your view on that?
Look, my heart says let them back and ask them questions, bring them back into society. But my head says we've tried all these sorts of things previously, yes, they might come back. Yes, they might have some information that's useful to us. But what is it that we don't already know? These characters know the landscape that they're heading into when they go over there. They might have a change of mind once they're there. Bring them back. They might have another change of mind, right? And I don't want that risk to be borne by the Australian public.
OK. We'll move on now. And the President of the Human Rights Commission is once again under pressure from the government, with Immigration Minister Peter Dutton calling on Gillian Triggs to consider her future in the role. Professor Triggs raised concerns about the federal government's immigration policies and changes to national security laws in 2 speeches last week. The Immigration Minister told Andrew Bolt it was very difficult for her to stay as head of the Commission.
Well, when you reduce the position to basically that of a political advocate, I think it is very difficult to continue on, and these are issues for Professor Triggs to contemplate.
It's not the first time the government has been critical of Professor Triggs, but Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus says she's doing a good job.
Peter Dutton is behaving like a bully. For 3 days now, we've seen him coming out and vilifying Professor Triggs. And it follows on, really, bullying and vilification from the Prime Minister, from senior cabinet ministers for many months now, and I think it has to stop.
Nathan, Professor Triggs has criticised the government plenty of times. Is it fair that the government returns fire?
No. Commissioners are put in place for a reason, that is that they stand independent of government. This is another example of this government in particular going after independent minds that have a different view to them. They've done it with the chief scientist, they've done it with Flannery and so on. Dutton ought to go to bed with a mirror and wake up to himself. It is not appropriate that people who are prepared to put themselves into these positions that are contentious are then vilified by a government. I think that's just wrong. I think it diminishes us as a nation, and Dutton, of all people, ought to know better.
Nick, is the government hypersensitive to criticism here?
I think that the role is independent, but I think it's inherent in the role that you have to maintain the confidence of the Australian people. And for me, I mean, Gillian Triggs lost me when she decided to award, or she said that the government should award $350,000 in compensation to an Indonesian refugee who'd beaten his pregnant Australian wife to death with a bicycle. She thought he needed compensation because he'd been unfairly detained. Now, that may be a legal view, but it's way out of step with what average people would think about the issue of domestic violence and how somebody should be treated in those circumstances. So I think regardless of the politics, I really do think that she has lost the trust and is damaging the Commission by staying on much longer.
Sarah, certainly the President of the Human Rights Commission has criticised both sides of politics. On Friday night, she criticised both major parties for what she said, teaming up to pass scores of laws over the past 15 years that threatened fundamental rights and freedoms.
Yeah, and even when she released her report on children in detention earlier this year, she was quite careful to criticise both Chris Bowen and Scott Morrison in that report. The question is, I mean, you know, more focus is always going to fall on the government. Do we really want a Human Rights Commissioner? To what extent do we want a Human Rights Commissioner to be able to criticise the government, I suppose, is the question.
I guess another question, Nathan, is whether raising the issue of the death penalty in Indonesia was a little bit sensitive. I mean, this was a comment that she made last week where she said, have we thought about what consequences are of pushing people back to our neighbour Indonesia? Is it any wonder that Indonesia will not engage with us on other issues we care about, like the death penalty? Was that a little bit too close?
I don't think so. I mean, I've had discussions with people who aren't politicians or office holders like that in the last month or so, and exactly that issue has been raised. Now, these are, I think they're legitimate issues for a Human Rights Commissioner to raise. When the relationship between a government and a commissioner gets toxic like this, then people do just get in the trenches and throw bombs at each other, regrettably, and that's the situation they're now in. Nick raises a good point about public confidence. I think we need to make a distinction between public confidence versus government confidence necessarily. I'm not certain that the public are as aligned with the government position as you may assert, and that may all come to pass in due course. But I think Triggs has tried to navigate a very difficult terrain, and she's going to attract criticism. But the fundamental principle of commissioners being in place to cast an independent eye, an independent examination of government actions, I think is sound, and I don't think it serves our medium and long-term purpose as a nation to go after those individuals.
Nick, what about those comments from Peter Dutton where he's accusing her of being a political advocate and therefore it's difficult for her role to continue? Isn't that her role to be a human rights advocate? And is the Minister misunderstanding her role?
It is her role to be a human rights advocate and to check what Australia is doing against, you know, the relevant requirements or the international treaties we sign on this. That's her role. But there's no doubt about it that I can't think of a previous Human Rights Commissioner whose role became so politicised. And on this question of children in detention, you know, it emerged in Senate estimates that she had spoken to Labor ministers and said, well, we won't do the inquiry now while you're in power. She held off that inquiry until Labor was out of power, so it fell entirely on the coalition government, even though by that time, of course, the number of children in detention was declining significantly.
But Nick, she did in that report criticise the previous Labor administration. It wasn't like she took the gloves off them.
Well, it would have been odd if she hadn't. But, you know, to wait until actually the number of children in detention was declining significantly, I believe it's now down to a little over 100 from, 1,300 when this government came to power. It does have, whether or not it's political, it has the impression of being political, and that's what's damaging the Human Rights Commission at the moment.
Yeah, well, maybe the problem is the coverage, because she did say in the report the number of children in detention has declined, but what concerned her and prompted her into conducting the report and releasing at that point was the rate of release of those children. And maybe that's a subtlety that didn't come through at the time. But yeah, I was thinking earlier, with the comments she made last week about the death penalty and turning back the boats and stuff. I mean, that's a link which I'm sure, as Nathan Rees said, plenty of people have been considering, but while there was still a chance that those executions could be stayed, the public debate was very careful, I felt. No one really wanted to go there and say something which could just flip the switch and ensure the execution of these men. We're after that, you know, we're in the post-execution stage now, so I don't know, maybe it would have come up earlier if we weren't being that careful.
OK, well, more people are buying illicit drugs like ecstasy and cocaine on the internet, according to a new report. The Global Drug Survey of 2015 has found the shift was a result of cheaper prices online compared with on the street. The report has revealed the price of ecstasy pills in Australia is now double the global average, and it appears Australians are among the biggest users of prescription drugs. To explain the findings, we're joined by illicit drugs researcher and emergency medicine consultant, Dr David Caldcott, who's also an associate professor at the University of Canberra. David, good to see you again.
You too.
Now, one of the really interesting things to come out of this survey is how expensive illicit drugs are in Australia. The cocaine price in Australia is 3 times what it is in the UK. Ecstasy is twice what it is in the UK. Is this high price in Australia having an impact on demand here?
I don't think so. It doesn't reflect in the consumption patterns that we see reported in any measure that we're looking at. We have an affluent society, and the people who want to consume drugs will find a way of doing so. it does have, I guess, a degree of reflection of the ability of law enforcement and customs to provide an interdiction, and also it probably reflects what might be described as the tyranny of distance. It's just more expensive to get drugs out here.
But we still have amongst the highest rates of ecstasy and methamphetamine use in the world, don't we?
Australians are very keen consumers of a wide variety of illicit products, as well as keen consumers of alcohol.
The survey does suggest that price is having an impact on where people buy their drugs. More and more people seem to be buying them online. What challenges does that pose for law enforcement officials?
It's actually very difficult for everybody who's involved. So there's a lot of focus that's placed on the change in the nature of the products that are coming online. So these novel illegal products, or novel psychotropic substances. What perhaps hasn't been taken up is the change in the market itself. So you've had these sort of pedestrian dinosaur-type markets of heroin, coke, and marijuana over years in the past, which have now been supplanted by a very dynamic and nimble market. People do their research online, they chat to each other about their experiences, they order their drugs from pharmaceutically grade manufactured sources, and they're delivered not by people wearing plaid shirts and with mullet haircuts, by the local postie at a cut price paid for usually by a cryptocurrency. So the entire market itself has changed, and that's of almost untraceable nature. The products themselves are difficult to identify as they come through customs, and of course when somebody consumes those products, they're very difficult to identify in the usual testing manner through urine and blood.
And what about for you as an emergency doctor? I mean, you get to know certain types of drugs that are in a market and whether that can lead to an overdose or not. Does that make it even harder for you guys?
10 years ago, it was not a bad gig working in the emergency department and looking at illicit drugs. There weren't that many available. Unfortunately, now we see this extraordinary evolution of drugs coming through very, very quickly, changing very, very rapidly. And it's not even drug geeks like myself can keep up with the rate of change. And it's very, very difficult for sort of more mainstream emergency doctors to keep across the effects, which can be substantially different to those they might expect.
Nathan?
Yeah, Doctor, it strikes me that there are some drugs, I think you referred them as the dinosaur drugs, the cocaines and the marijuana and so on, that have become well established in our society, that our means for dealing with them through law enforcement are diminished simply because of their prevalence. But drugs such as ice that are causing real drama across Australia at the moment, it strikes me that there's a different approach required when a new damaging drug hits a nation or a society than the approach that we might use for harm minimisation with regards to heroin or something like that. Are you familiar, or are there jurisdictions you're aware of that tackle these things as they arrive rather than a one-size-fits-all that we seem to be doing now?
I think it's really important that we tailor our responses to the Australian market. I think, one of the interesting things about the methamphetamine market, whereas 10 years ago when Steve had longer hair, the methamphetamine market was largely home produced from mom and pop labs in rural Australia out of the backs of cars. What we're seeing is some very high grade methamphetamine coming through the same routes as the novel psychotropic products being manufactured overseas. I think one of the important things from the data we're seeing is that we're kind of maxed out as far as reducing the supply is concerned. We're trying very hard to do that. And what we really need to do, in the harder side of the equation, and the reason why it's not addressed very frequently by politicians and sociologists, is that the demand side is probably where the money is at now. Why are people turning to this in this way in Australia? What is it about modern life in Australia that makes young people want to escape it, be it pharmacologically as opposed to geographically? And I think that's where the next big yield in reducing drug use lies. I don't think there's much more that people can do about reducing the supply side. The market has mutated to avoid detection, and now we need to think about demand.
I'd like to ask you something related to that if I can. So the Global Drugs Survey also, at the same time as releasing its data, they released a user's guide which contained some ratings that I've not seen before, which basically rated harm minimisation strategies against whether they affected personal enjoyment of consuming those drugs. I mean, is that real-world harm minimisation, or is that sending the wrong message?
I think sending the wrong message is the jargon that's usually bandied about in the sort of political football arena that is politics. Sending the wrong message really has got no place in medicine. The right message is, what can we do to stop people getting hurt or killed? The moral side, the philosophical side of drug consumption, is that's something that can be debated in churches or places of worship or in houses of parliament. At the very cutting edge side of things, we want policies that stop young people getting hurt, young people getting killed. And if you accept, as many people do now, that young people are, a certain group of them at least, going to dabble with illicit products, then it probably is beholden upon us as healthcare professionals to make sure that they don't die while they do that. And if we can provide them with messages that prevent them from dying to such a point that they decide that they're going to give it away and that they're going to do something more productive with their life, I think that's successful. The Australian sort of approach to this has been a little bit of a last bastion. There have been some very progressive policies around the world which show quite clearly that you can reduce the amount of people dying from drug use by accepting that some people are going to use drugs no matter what you do to them.
Well, let's pick up on one of those examples. I mean, Portugal has been mentioned in this new European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction survey, which has come out today as well. And they say for every million citizen deaths in Portugal, just 3 of them are coming from drug overdose. Now, that is much lower than, say, in the UK, where the figures are about 15 times higher. Now, Portugal has decriminalised drug use. What are they doing right when it comes to minimising deaths from drug use?
Well, they've bitten the bullet and they've done the unspeakable. And they've, as you said, removed the criminal sanctions associated with drug consumption. It's not that they've legalised them. What they've done is they've said you're not going to have a criminal record if we catch you with, I think it's anything less than 10 days worth of supply. You'll still be fined. If you're a member of certain professions, you may have your ability to practice in those professions confined.
So have they poured that money out of the criminal justice system into the treatment system?
That's correct. And so what you have is this enormous pot of money designed to reduce the number of people consuming drugs and to address those people who are harmed from drugs use. You do see a spike in drugs consumption. So I think since it's been introduced, it's gone from about 5 to 12% of the population consuming drugs. As you say, far fewer people are dying, far fewer people get HIV, far fewer people are on long-term treatment. They are weaned off their long-term treatment for drug consumption. So I guess there's a grown-up decision that needs to be asked of most modern societies is, which do you want? You can't have both. You either choose that a smaller amount of people getting hurt and killed, accepting that more people will use, or you go the other way and you bring the hammer down in a 1920s and 30s prohibition model and let the deaths and injuries to young people be a lesson to the rest of that population. All
right, Dr. David Caldicott, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Well, Labor says it's looking at changes to negative gearing laws to address housing affordability and to increase the budget revenue. On the weekend, the Greens put forward a proposal to wind back negative gearing for future housing investments, saying it would provide $42 billion over 10 years in increased revenue. The Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Lee, says negative gearing has to be included in any assessment of house prices.
You'd expect a responsible opposition to be looking carefully into this, particularly given where the budget is. But Chris Bowen's laid out clear parameters. He said we certainly wouldn't do anything that would disadvantage existing owners, and we'd have a careful mind to making sure that there's new housing supply coming into the market.
Now, Sarah, you are part of the generation of those who are mostly locked out of the housing market in Sydney and Melbourne. Is this worth looking at, winding back negative gearing?
Well, look, as a card-carrying member of Gen Y, I have to say, look, anything that could help would be worth talking about. Gen Y doesn't take anything for granted. I think they're quite conservative and industrious when it comes to thinking about buying property. I mean, this is a generation that hasn't had free education. We sort of entered the workforce around about the same time as the global financial crisis, which didn't really bode well for any of us. And we're also the future workforce, the taxpayers supporting an ageing population. So anything that encourages Gen Y to be stable and healthy and happy, I think, is worth discussion.
Nick, Joe Hockey has said that he is worried about intergenerational inequality, but the Coalition has previously ruled out any changes to negative gearing. Is it worth a look at?
Well, I think it's just one of those fantasy political policy discussions we have every now and then. I mean, I think the cold fact is that Labor, once they've looked at this, will do nothing or very little to change this regulation for a very good reason, and that is because the people who do negatively gear, the people who invest in property, are people like ordinary people in the streets. It's not necessarily a pastime of the rich in this country. Ordinary people invest their superannuation or their savings in property, and it has a very good effect, and that is to increase the supply of rental accommodation, therefore make it cheaper. So I think the danger of this policy is that it would have the opposite effect, and actually to what people expect, and that is actually to raise the cost, particularly of rental housing, which of course would be a hard thing for those who can't afford to buy.
But Nick, certainly credible economists like Saul Eslake and John Daly don't think that would happen. They think it wouldn't have an impact on supply.
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what they're saying, but if that's what they're saying, I disagree with them on this. It seems to me that there is a problem with housing prices, a big problem in this country, that we have some of the most expensive housing prices in the world. We're up there with the United Kingdom. And if we want to get prices down to more realistic levels, say Germany or the United States as a proportion of average income, then we have to look at some serious measures, I think, on the supply side, on allowing more development and reducing the kind of restrictions there are on development.
Nathan, can I get your view on that? Is this part of the housing affordability problem, negative gearing?
Look, it is, but it depends who you talk to and the extent. The figures that I've seen that stuck in my mind were that 9 out of 10 properties for which people are negatively gearing are pre-existing homes, so the extent to which it's generating new homes is questionable, and I think you can tweak that. The second element, though, goes to Nick's point. He is spot on. Some years ago, when this was talked about, the figure that I recall was something like 1 in 3 people in the greater metropolitan area of Sydney have an interest in an investment property. And they aren't the places that you think. These are people who have been on award wages all their lives, who have had PAYE tax taken out of their tax packet before they even get a chance to avoid it each week. And if there's a scheme available for them that is low-hanging fruit for everyone who wants to reform the tax system, frankly, I'd rather let them keep that and get stuck into the big end of town.
All right, but Sarah, certainly this could become a political issue, couldn't it, for under 40s? I mean, housing affordability is a pretty hot topic.
Well, look, renting is not fun, and I think we can all agree that the current system is not ideal. So I'm not saying the Greens' proposal is perfect by any means, but I think it is worth rethinking the system that we have. And the figures that you mentioned about the people who really are the investment property owners, the ABC's Michael Yander wrote a really great piece about this where he broke down the figures. And he basically found that, in fact, that statistic of, 75% or so being on, an average income of 80k, was incorrect. It's actually much lower. So there are investment properties being owned by the big end of town, and it is very difficult to get into the market.
OK, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thanks very much to all of our panellists tonight, Nick Cater, Sarah Dingle and Nathan Rees. You can check out the website at abc.net.au/The Drum, where you can read that Michael Yander piece. John Barron is on tomorrow night. I'll see you soon.